said that families dispersed for social or political reasons to different parts of the globe were like satellites or capsules of culture, who then became the main custodians of a cultural preservation, where time more or less stood still. Like other recently arrived migrants following World War II, settlers from regional Calabria immersed themselves in the familiar and clung to the traditions and customs of their homeland. They placed importance on maintaining cultural attributes because of the belief that back in their place of origin, the same things happened. Their new sites of settlement defined their sense of Italianness as they maintained contact with other Paesani, Calabrese and Italians. By clinging to their culture, it was a way of preserving it. Italian-Australian scholar Gerardo Papalia stated, immigrants themselves created their own little homeland within domestic walls. However, this homeland was fabricated with crystallised memories and inhabited with behaviour patterns deriving from what they had left. Based on this premise, my arts practice-based research investigates the experience of Calabrian migrants from the Aspromonte region of the province of Reggio Calabria, with a focus on the towns of Bladi and Natile, where my parents originate, who left Italy in the 1950s. Through scholarly articles, books, personal interviews, and my own experiences, I have explored how these migrants transported a microcosm of their culture and cultural practices particular to their region to their new home in Mildura in Victoria's northwest. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
My research positions the influence of the Calabrian diaspora on northwest Victoria within the broader historical framework of the history of Calabria itself. My research also My research also explores broadly the global experience of migration, the factors which led to Italian migration to Australia, cultural loss and preservation, and nostalgia in second and subsequent generations. In 2015, I travelled to the province of Reggio Calabria. The trip provided me with the opportunity to go back to the place of origin in order to compare the two places, Reggio Calabria and northwest Victoria. Through the modes of narrative, inquiry, autoethnography and traditional methods of making and women's work, my multidisciplinary arts practice-based research investigates, interprets and translates the experiences of Calabrian settlers to Victoria's northwest in a contemporary visual art and sociological context. Autoethnographic research and its incorporation of storytelling is of particular interest. As educational anthropologist He Wan Chang explains, transcends mere narration of self to engage in cultural analysis and interpretation. Notions of belief in religious practices, gender roles and stereotypes, family relationships, nostalgia, cultural loss and preservation are also explored in my work. My research feeds my performances by inspiring the imagined stories embedded within my psyche. Imagined because they are partly my concocted version of the realities lived by my grandparents, parents and relatives and their families. My interest in performance methodologies began in my 2013 research project, Familia, Memory, Migration, Spirituality and Cultural Practice as a First Generation Australian. Galabrisella Mia, pictured, was a 4-hour durational performance and video installation. It centred on the enactment of a traditional Calabrian folk song sung by my grandparents enjoyed singing. The performance attempted to reconnect with my grandparents through the transformation of my appearance by clothing myself in items once belonging to both my grandmothers, Domenica and Elena. And with the addition of temporary plaited hairpieces, I reimagined the style of dress from their paese, circa 1950. For this performance, I clothed myself in 2 dresses which had belonged to my maternal grandmother, Domenica. I began the enactment in her dress of Italian red and black check, worn on her migration journey to Australia, while I sang happily along to the folk song Galabrisella, playing on the record player nearby. The feeling of the performance gradually became more sombre when I revealed the black dress Nonna Domenica wore to my parents' wedding, the year following her 16-year-old son's death in 1960. The work represents the joy of moving to an exciting new life in a new country, to that of mourning the loss of a son. No more singing, celebration or happiness. The performance ended in silence, exhausted from 4 hours of vocal and physical endurance. Working good. One of my fieldwork research goals while on my 2015 trip to Calabria was to make the pilgrimage to the Sanctuary of Our Lady of Polsi by foot from Melbourne, which is approximately 6 hours by foot. But due to heavy rain a few days before our arrival, we were advised against walking due to the danger of falling rocks and landslides. As a compromise, the trip was made by minibus. You have to be flexible. The 2.5-hour journey winded its way up to the highest point of the Aspromonte National Park at Montalto, then snaked its way further down to the Sanctuary of Our Lady at Polsi. Upon alighting at Polsey, I resumed the pilgrimage into the church as if I had made it on foot, dressed in the traditional manner of the Anziani, headscarf and dark-coloured clothing. Post-memory is an idea which Marianne Hirsch uses to describe the relationship that the generation after bears the personal, collective and cultural trauma of those who came before to experiences they remember only by means of the stories, images and behaviours among which they grew up. These experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. My visit to the sanctuary enacted a transmitted memory passed on to me by my grandparents and father Antonio, all now deceased. Through my methodology of live art performance, I actively attempt to engage my familial and feminine history. An integral part of my practice-led research is the transformation of self into an imagined version of my grandmother's. Donna Gabacha stated in conversation during the Transnationalising Modern Languages Conference program in 2016, we grasp for those embodied forms of labour in order to keep culture tied to the very material, pragmatic, embodied lives of the people whose minds and subjectivities we want to understand. A lot of different decisions and approaches go into the preparation of my live performances. For instance, I grew my hair for the 2-year plus duration of my master's candidature, still at the same length. My goal was to be able to style my hair in the manner in which my grandmothers and many other women migrants adopted. Both of them would style their hair with a centre part, plaiting their long tresses on either side of their head, applying homemade olive oil to smooth the hair during the braiding process. Once each plait was secured individually at each end, the hair was then crossed over at the nape of the neck and affixed with a bobby pin at the top of the head, which I've done today. The growth of my hair grew as part of my methodology, my attachment to it both literal and sentimental, the growing, styling and maintaining it, and the emotion in the decision to keep my hair at this length and its thread to my deceased grandmother's is a decision I'm constantly rationalising. Will I cut it or won't I? Tracciando fili del passato is an ongoing series of live art performances, installations and video explorations which explores my self-transformation into my nonnas. During these enactments, I make artefacts utilising traditional women's modes of making, sewing, embroidery and crochet. These activities are chosen in order to highlight the significance of women's handmade craftwork, which were once an important aspect of family relationships, passed from mother to daughter. The work is a manifestation of the hopes, dreams and desires of migrant women and strives to honour their voices, which were not always heard due to the dominant gender roles within the Calabrian diaspora. Tracing threads of the past sewing was a live art performance and installation which occupied the window of the art vault in Mildura. I created a wardrobe of clothing items similar to those my own mother and grandmother made soon after their arrival in Australia in the 1950s. The items were sewn at my mother's treadle-powered Singer sewing machine, which she used to make most of her own and my grandmother's clothes. The objects I chose to make during my live art sewing performance were carefully considered. To remain authentic, I consulted my mum on some of the things that she and my grandmother made when they first arrived in Australia. I created a collection of essential clothing items, pants, batanti, bras, veggipetti, petticoats, sottovesti, aprons, fardali or grembiule, and finally an outfit, top, skirt and headscarf, camicia, gonna e un mucatore. Some of the items which migrant settlers needed for everyday living. In my own way, I constructed an imagined 1950s immigrant's wardrobe. Over the 2-year plus period of my MA, my hands have been busy with projects exploring the themes I have already described, including a series of pencil drawings based on some of the Calabrian proverbs said by my grandparents and family. The drawings also reference the book by German linguist Gerhard Rolfs, Calabria Salento, Saggi di Storia Linguistica, Studi e Ricerche. I can tell you what that translates to later. Underneath each drawing, the proverb is written in Italian, Calabrian dialect and English. The Sailing into History, Displacements and Arrivals exhibition, curated by Lila Caridi, who's here, was a collaboration between the exhibition curator, Multicultural Arts Victoria and Museo Italiano, and revealed the biographical narratives through photographs, memorabilia and documents of people who came to Australia by ship up to the 1970s through the historical entry points of Princess and Station Pier, Port Melbourne, and made a permanent home in Australia. For Michel Foucault, the ship was a repository of dreams. I imagine that for many migrants who arrived after World War II, the ship signified a crossing of a vast threshold of oceans, washing away their past lives to awaken their hopes and dreams upon landing on foreign shores at the other end of the earth. Included in the exhibition was my maternal grandmother Domenica's migration dress, which I wore in my 2013 Calliparì performance. It also included the shoes and handbag, which completed her outfit, pictured on the left. The installation at the Museo also included my mother's account of their journey to and experience of first arriving in Australia. Tracing Threads of the Past embroidery continued my series of live art performances and installations. This time I created embroideries based on my Calabrian proverb drawings. The performances occurred at a number of venues, including an empty shop in Redcliffs, where I live, and also at Luci Italiane as part of the public programs for the Sailing into History, Displacements and Arrivals exhibition. The work also referenced biancheria items inspired by those handmade by migrant settlers for their own glory boxes before emigration to Australia. The embroideries are threaded through leftover fabric remnants from my mother's glory box linen. The embroidery I created during my 3-day residency at Luci Italiane, which is at the top here, La Luna, which was inspired by the full moon occurring at the time. The full moon is considered by some to bring out the worst in people. Some people report incidences of feeling highly emotional, violent, or other extreme emotions. In my case, it was guilt about leaving my family in Mildura for 4 days while I headed off to Melbourne to my residency at the Museo. The gender role expectations for women and men often place heavily on my conscience. My mother's generation saw themselves, as Donna Gabacha wrote, domestically devoted servants to their husbands and children. As a contemporary woman, I often feel frustrated by the division of labour in the home and how historically it was different for men in comparison to women. Incidentally, these artworks are to be included in an exhibition in Los Angeles at the Italian-American Museum of Los Angeles in May. In 2016, I was invited to present a live art performance as part of the Beyond Borders Transnational Italy exhibition at the British School at Rome. During the Transnationalising Modern Languages conference, at which I also presented a paper. During this iteration of Tracing Threads of the Past, I made an apron, an essential item worn by my paternal grandmother Eleanor. The apron was created from items collected from in Italy and Australia from various people, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over the various elements that made up that work. But the end result was an apron from some embroideries on there as well. And the sewing machine I was using was borrowed from a Rome-based artist, Sara Basta. Tracing Threads of the Past collected crochet comprised crochet chains of red embroidery thread, a representation of the chain migration scheme which many migrants now settled in northwest Victoria were participants. While the migrant men were the first scouts, effectively surveying the land where they would eventually make their new home, the receiving country was not thought of as home until the women, in some cases with children, also arrived, creating other Italies in the process. Crochet is traditionally seen as a stereotypically feminine craft. I reimagined the idea that it was the women, wives, mothers and children of migrants who maintained the ties from the homeland to the men who had already departed. The chains of crochet became what artist Biamore calls filo della vita, or the thread of life. The work has had other iterations. At the opening of the Beyond Borders exhibition at Museo Italiano in May, on the left, my cousin, sister and I metaphorically bound ourselves together, reinforcing our familial bonds through crochet. A few of them are here. Tracciando fili del passato combines a piece of my mother's hand-embroidered biancheria crafted during her pre-teen years in Calabria for her credo before migrating to Australia. My mother began receiving instruction in embroidery from the age of 9 in her hometown of Plati in the province of Reggio Calabria. It was the expectation that all girls learn needlework from a young age. The vintage cotton fabric has become very fragile and is now literally threadbare from years of use as a pillowcase for my mother's bed linen. I have hand embroidered the words "Tracciando fili del passato" in white thread at the top. The threads, my own and my mother's, link us to Calabria, northwest Victoria. The work ties my mother and I together and forms a dual dialogue between us, further weaving our lives together in a contemporary visual form. The emotion of co-creating something with my mother has also reinstated the chain of passing down traditions from mother to daughter. The installation currently on show here at Museo Italiano is made from crocheted red cotton, filaments of gold lurex thread, safety pins, religious icon souvenirs and human hair. Artist Danielle Hobbs said of red thread, the symbolic use of red thread, ribbon, cord, flannel and wool is widespread in folklore. The palliative and protective properties of the string are derived from its colour. Red, crimson and scarlet, these are all defined in most English dictionaries as the colour of blood. The redness of blood links the colour of red to the living body. This makes red a symbol of life, that is traditionally associated with vitality, good luck, health and joy. It is a colour that may also be gendered as a feminine symbol. Blood is associated with the reproductive life cycle. The larger red crochet shape incidentally formed itself into a nipple-like shape, which my mother doesn't like me to rip. Okay. And I'm almost finished. I was just going to touch on the use of hair, which I mentioned I had been collecting since 2013.
Luci, can
I have.
Can you just take it easy? I don't care how late we are. Out of respect to the work, please, just... We'll be
I was
fine.
asked to
She
make
was
sure
asked to
this
make
ends
time.
exactly at 3:40
Yeah.
adamantly by the organisers.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's my task.
Okay. And we'll end there. Sorry.